Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. They say the road itself is cursed, but I only half believed it. Until the night I made the mistake of walking it alone. It was the dead end of October, Halloween on the cusp, when the sky sits heavy and dull, as if it's soaking up the cold. My small town has few places to be late at night, so when a group of friends dared me to take the old road back home by myself, I shrugged it off, laughed, and accepted. But once I left the glow of the streetlights, alone on the cracked pavement that led into the blackness of the woods, I felt an uneasy chill settling into my bones. Old legends whispered that the road had claimed people, that they'd vanished without a trace. They said if you listened closely, you could hear footsteps following you. Soft at first, just the crunch of dead leaves, but that they'd grow louder with each step, keeping pace, as if something just out of sight was shadowing you. My heart pounded, the stories creeping in with each crunch beneath my feet. I'd planned to laugh it off the whole way back. But the silence was so thick, so crushing, that I dared not make a sound. The road itself looked like a scar through the trees, broken and barely lit by the thin slice of moon overhead. Roots tore through the cracks in the pavement, and shadows from gnarled branches clawed across the path. Each step seemed to amplify the silence around me, pressing it against my ears until I could barely stand it. And then came the smell. It started faint, a whiff of something sour, moldy, like wet earth left too long in the dark. I told myself it was just the woods, just fallen leaves decaying, or the stagnant pond I knew was up ahead. But the smell grew stronger, filling the air until it felt like I was wading through it. I covered my mouth, gagging, but as I kept walking, I noticed something even more unnerving. I could hear footsteps, faint and echoing, somewhere behind me. At first I froze, standing still with my heart hammering, straining my ears to catch the faintest sound. When the footsteps stopped, I shook my head, laughing at myself. My friends would never let me hear the end of it if I ran back now. But then, they started again, louder this time, closer. Panic crept in, even as I told myself it was impossible. There was nobody on this road but me. But the footsteps matched my own exactly, echoing through the woods as if someone, or something, was mimicking my every move. And then, as I forced myself to glance over my shoulder, I saw it. A figure, barely visible, just at the edge of the moonlight. It was human-shaped, but too tall. Limbs stretched unnaturally long. It had no face, just a blank, pale oval where its features should have been, the moonlight glinting off its smooth skin. I could barely make it out in the shadows, but it stood motionless, like it was waiting, studying me despite its lack of eyes. I felt frozen, too terrified to even breathe. But instinct took over, and before I knew it, I was sprinting down the road, my heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. I could hear the footsteps behind me, now frantic, pounding in sync with my own. The path ahead grew darker as I left the moonlight behind. I barely knew where I was going, and my mind was a blur, filled with one primal thought. Run, just get away. But I could feel it behind me, closer and closer, as if it was reaching out, stretching its long, unnatural limbs toward me. A sharp pain shot through my ankle as I stumbled on a root, and I hit the ground hard, tasting dirt and blood. My hands scrambled against the gravel as I tried to stand, but a paralyzing chill swept over me, and I dared a glance behind. The figure was closer now, moving slowly, deliberately, gliding rather than walking. Its blank face tilted slightly, as if amused by my attempt to escape. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ankle, and bolted into the trees beside the road, branches tearing at my clothes as I pushed through the underbrush, deeper into the woods. I couldn't hear it anymore, but I didn't dare stop, tripping and stumbling through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself in a small clearing, the old, rotting remains of a shack in the center. I backed against a tree, chest heaving, struggling to calm my frantic breaths. Silence closed in around me, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figure stood on the edge of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadows. It hadn't followed me into the woods. I could feel that somehow. But it was waiting, lingering at the edge of the clearing as if it knew I had nowhere else to go. "Please," I whispered, though I knew it wouldn't understand. It tilted its head again, and even though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting. It didn't move, but the shadows seemed to creep closer, as if the darkness itself were alive, closing in around me. Suddenly I remembered the stories, fragments I'd heard as a kid. Something about how the road would draw you in, lead you off its path, into places no one could find, places where things waited. I forced myself to look away from the figure, turning toward the old shack. Maybe if I hid there, maybe if I stayed out of sight, it would lose interest. The shack was barely standing, the wood rotting and splintered, but I pushed open the door and slipped inside. It was pitch black, the air thick with mildew and decay. I crouched in a corner trying to quiet my breathing, willing myself to become invisible. And that's when I heard it, whispering, faint and desperate, as if someone were just on the other side of the wall. I pressed myself against the corner, feeling splinters dig into my back, the whispers growing louder, words I couldn't understand, but filled with panic. I wasn't alone in this shack. My mind spun with fear, but I stayed rooted to the spot, frozen by the voices swirling around me. The whispers grew frantic, then faded, leaving a heavy silence. But just when I thought it was over, a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the darkness. "Why did you come here?" The question hung in the air, chilling me to the core. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Outside, the figure was waiting, still as a statue. I saw it through the cracks in the wall, standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless. But now, as I stared at it, something changed. Its pale face seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, the smooth surface warping, like a ripple through water, until an expression slowly formed, a mouth stretching wide, grinning as if it knew something I didn't. I turned away, gasping as the whispers began again, louder, desperate, filling the air until they became a scream that rose and rose, piercing and endless, echoing through the shack and into my bones. I don't remember much after that, just fragments, sprinting through the trees, branches clawing at my face, the road reappearing out of nowhere, like it had been waiting. I stumbled back onto it, breathless, and looked behind me one last time. The figure was gone. I limped the rest of the way home, not daring to look back, not stopping until I was inside with the door locked behind me. But the whispers, they haven't left me. They come in the dead of night when everything's quiet, filling my room with that same desperate terror I felt in the woods. People say the old road is just a story, a joke to scare kids. But I know the truth. I know that something is out there, waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, watching for anyone foolish enough to walk that cursed road alone. They say the dead can't hurt you, but if that's true, then what was I doing running for my life through the cemetery at midnight? I don't know how I ended up there, in that cemetery, under a full moon that painted everything with a sickly glow. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the thrill of pushing boundaries. Or maybe I was just stupid. All I know is, one minute I was bored and restless, and the next I was sneaking through a broken iron gate, stepping into a cemetery that people in town swore was cursed. My friends had dared me, sure, but I hadn't expected them to disappear so quickly. They'd said they'd follow me in, but the moment I crossed that threshold, I turned around to find them already gone, like they'd vanished into thin air. A part of me wanted to bolt right then and there, but another part, the part that's always gotten me into trouble, urged me forward. After all, what could really happen? The dead can't hurt you, right? The cemetery had always been rumored to be haunted. Local stories, whispers from old-timers sitting outside the general store, told of strange occurrences that happened after midnight, when shadows seemed to move on their own and eerie sounds echoed from the depths of the earth. People had disappeared here, they said, and some claimed that if you lingered too long, the dead would try to claim you as one of their own. A gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying a faint, chilling sound that could have been a whisper, or maybe just the wind stirring the leaves. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it clung to me like a damp fog. My breath came out in white puffs, even though it wasn't that cold, and every step felt like I was walking deeper into something I couldn't quite understand. But whatever it was waiting for me. I walked past rows of tombstones, their inscriptions worn and faded. Some were tilted, almost as if the ground itself was trying to swallow them. A thick mist curled around my feet, and the moon cast long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch and reach toward me. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible at first, standing beside a tall, imposing gravestone. It was draped in black, its head lowered as though in mourning. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games. But as I crept closer, I saw that it wasn't a shadow. It was real. The figure stood there, motionless, as if waiting for me. My heart hammered in my chest, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. The figure slowly raised its head, and beneath the hood, I caught a glimpse of hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. My pulse thundered as I realized this wasn't some person out for a midnight stroll. This was something else, something wrong. I took a step back, but the figure mirrored me, tilting its head in a slow, deliberate motion. Its mouth opened, but no words came out. Only a dry, raspy sound that grated against my eardrums. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. And then it started moving toward me. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if savoring each moment. Panic surged, and I turned, breaking into a sprint, my heart pounding in time with my footsteps. I dodged tombstones, vaulted over low iron fences, and skidded around statues of angels with chipped wings. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel it following, the cold presence pressing in around me. I stumbled, crashing against a large, ancient tree. The rough bark scraped my hands, and I tasted the coppery tang of blood in my mouth. The figure was still there, getting closer, its grin widening with every step. Desperation clawed at my throat. I looked around wildly, searching for an escape, for anything to put distance between me and whatever this thing was. My gaze landed on an old mausoleum. Its doors were cracked open, and inside, darkness yawned like an open mouth. Without thinking, I dashed toward it, shoving myself through the gap and into the pitch black. Inside, it was colder, the kind of chill that gnaws at your bones. The only sound was my labored breathing and the echo of my own heartbeat. I pressed myself against the wall, forcing my breaths to quiet. I waited, counting the seconds, hoping the thing hadn't followed me. But then, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps that grew louder and louder. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it. It was there, just outside the mausoleum, waiting. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell, so thick it was suffocating. I held my breath, my body pressed against the cold stone. And then, a whisper. Faint, almost like a sigh. "Why did you come here?" The voice was soft, almost childlike, but filled with an unsettling hunger. I tried to respond, but my voice came out as a choked whisper. I was dared. A pause, then a low, sickening laugh that echoed around the mausoleum, filling every corner, wrapping around me like a shroud. They always come here on a dare. They always come, but they don't always leave. The darkness seemed to press closer, tightening around me. I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers grazing my skin. I jerked away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt as though they were closing in, trapping me with whatever horror lingered in the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the presence seemed to recede, like a shadow slipping away. The mausoleum fell silent once more, and I was left alone, shivering and gasping for air. I didn't dare move, afraid that any sound would draw it back. But after a few minutes, the silence grew too heavy to bear. I took a tentative step toward the door, straining to hear any sound outside. There was nothing. Maybe it was gone. I pushed the door open, peering outside. The cemetery was still and silent, the gravestones casting long shadows in the moonlight. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I forced myself to move, to get as far away from that mausoleum as possible. As I walked, I realized something strange. The path I'd come down seemed different. The tombstones were older, more weathered, and the names etched into them were unfamiliar. I frowned, glancing around, a sick feeling churning in my gut. And then I saw it. A tombstone, cracked and covered in moss, with my name on it. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I took a step back, and then another, but everywhere I looked, I saw more tombstones, each one bearing the names of my friends, my family, even people I didn't recognize. Panic flared, and I broke into a run, weaving through the graves, desperate to find a way out. But the more I ran, the deeper I seemed to go, the paths twisting and turning in impossible ways. It was as if the cemetery itself was alive, trapping me within its endless maze of gravestones. I heard the whisper again, soft and chilling. "You belong to us now." My heart pounded as I stumbled, tripping over a root and crashing to the ground. When I looked up, the figure was there, looming over me, its hollow eyes gleaming with a dark, hungry light. I scrambled to my feet, but my body felt heavy, like the very earth was pulling me down, holding me in place. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath washing over me. And as its hands reached for me, pulling me into the darkness, I realized I would never leave this cemetery. They say the dead can't hurt you, but they can take you. I've been a firefighter for nearly 15 years now, but nothing I've seen has ever come close to the night I got the call about the house on Maple Ridge. Not that I'd ever admit that to the guys down at the station. They'd think I'd lost it. Sometimes I wonder if maybe I have. It was a simple enough call that night. A structure fire in an old abandoned house in the middle of a neighborhood most people don't even know exists. I only knew it because it had a reputation. A creepy one. They called it the house that eats people. Local legend, of course, mostly spread by high school kids who'd take their friends there on dares. But people went missing over the years, sure. Every town has its ghost stories, and the house on Maple Ridge was ours. People used to say that if you stepped inside, you'd never come back out. As I rode out to the site in the dead of night, the fog blanketing the road in thick clouds, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. It was too quiet. There were no lights from the houses we passed. Every house on Maple Ridge was a dark silhouette, like something from a black and white horror film. And the only thing alive out there was the glow of the flames. When we finally pulled up, I could see it wasn't a big fire, just a slow, steady burn from somewhere inside. There wasn't any visible damage outside yet, just a faint orange glow pulsing from behind the windows, like the house itself was breathing in and out, in and out. I shivered and told myself it was just the way old houses looked in firelight. We approached cautiously, scanning for hazards. The house had definitely seen better days. Windows hung open like dead eyes, and the entire place sagged on its foundation. Its clapboards had peeled, and vines crept up the walls, like fingers wrapping around the structure, strangling it slowly over time. It almost seemed hungry. "Are you getting that smell?" my partner Jenkins asked, scrunching up his nose. "Yeah. Can't put my finger on it," I muttered. It was more than smoke. Something else lingered in the air, a thick, coppery odor, the kind you smelled at accident sites where blood soaked into the asphalt. "Think someone's inside?" Jenkins asked. "Let's check it out," I replied, trying to sound steady, but my stomach was already churning. We pried open the front door, which resisted, groaning like a wounded animal. Inside, the glow intensified, casting our shadows long and monstrous against the walls. The smell was stronger here, thick and metallic. I felt like I was wading through it as we made our way through the entry hall. Every sound seemed too loud, our boots against the creaky floor, the distant crackle of fire, the pounding of my heart. And the further in we went, the heavier the air seemed to get, almost thick enough to press against my skin. It was like stepping into some kind of dark, suffocating cloud. "Let's start with the first floor and work our way up," Jenkins suggested, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, trying to keep my nerves in check. Room by room, we searched. The house was filled with clutter, old furniture and belongings left behind like someone had just walked out one day and never returned. Layers of dust coated everything, and cobwebs stretched between the furniture, hanging low like ghostly shrouds. In the kitchen, I stopped short, feeling my blood run cold. A broken mirror hung on the wall, and beneath it, something had been scrawled in what looked like dried blood. I leaned in closer to read it, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Get out while you can." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Jenkins, you seeing this?" He looked over my shoulder, his face pale in the dim light. "Yeah, this place gives me the creeps, man. Let's just find the source of the fire and get out of here." We continued down the hall, the flames guiding us deeper into the house like some malevolent force pulling us forward. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint whisper, or see a shadow shift out of the corner of my eye. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Finally, we found the source of the fire in the basement. A small, contained flame was flickering in the center of the floor, surrounded by a strange assortment of items. Candles, faded photographs, and bones, all arranged in a circle. It looked like some kind of ritual. "What the hell is this?" Jenkins whispered, stepping closer. As he reached for one of the bones, a loud creak sounded above us. It echoed through the walls, reverberating in the silence. We both froze, looking up as if expecting the ceiling to cave in. Then something moved in the shadows just outside the flickering light. A figure, half-formed and shifting, like it was both there and not there at the same time. The basement door slammed shut, plunging us into near darkness. I scrambled for my flashlight, flicking it on and shining it towards the door, but it was locked tight. We pounded on it, calling for help, but no one answered. The air grew colder, the coppery smell turning sharper and more sickly sweet, filling my nose and making me gag. "Hello?" Jenkins called out, his voice breaking. "Is someone up there?" A low growl echoed from the shadows. We spun around, shining our flashlights into the corners of the basement. The figure was gone, but something else was there. Dozens of faces, their eyes wide and hollow, staring at us from the walls. I realized, with a sickening lurch, that they weren't faces at all. They were impressions pressed into the walls, their features frozen in horror. It was as if the house itself had absorbed them, swallowed them whole, and kept them trapped here forever. The stories were true. This place ate people. The ground beneath us began to shift, the floorboards creaking and buckling. It was as if the house was waking up, coming alive around us. I felt something brush against my leg and looked down to see hands, dozens of them, reaching up from the floorboards, grabbing at my ankles and pulling me down. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but they only tightened their grip, pulling me deeper into the house. Jenkins was screaming, trying to pull me free, but the hands had him too. We were both sinking, being drawn into the floor, into the house itself. "No, let us go," I shouted, my voice echoing in the darkness. But the house only tightened its hold, pulling us deeper into its hungry maw. The walls began to close in, pressing against us from all sides. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the terrified face of Jenkins, sinking beside me, his eyes wide with horror as he disappeared into the floor. They found our truck abandoned outside the house the next morning. No one ever saw us come back out. The house stood there, quiet and empty, its walls hiding the secrets of all the souls it had claimed. The next group of firefighters that came to investigate found nothing but silence and shadows. And when they turned to leave, one of them could swear he heard something, a faint whisper, a voice calling from the walls, begging to be let out. No one goes near that house anymore. But every now and then, if you pass by on a quiet night, you can hear the sounds of those it swallowed, their voices still trapped inside, forever calling for help. When I first heard the rumor about the old, abandoned tunnels beneath the city, I was skeptical. People said they went on for miles, spiraling under streets and buildings, an intricate labyrinth built for reasons no one really remembered. The legends claimed they were haunted, cursed, that people had gone in and never come back out. That, of course, was just urban folklore. Or so I thought. I had no idea that stepping into that dark maze would change my life forever. It was a gray Saturday morning when I got a call from my friend Ben, who'd always had a taste for the creepy and unusual. He told me about a secret entrance to the tunnels, a hatch hidden behind an old maintenance shed on the outskirts of town. "I already scoped it out," he said, excitement buzzing in his voice. "It's totally accessible. We can go check it out tonight." A part of me hesitated. Even the thought of stepping into an endless, pitch-black maze felt unsettling. But my curiosity got the better of me. Besides, I didn't want to be the only one who chickened out. So I agreed. As the sun set that evening, Ben picked me up, and we drove to the edge of town. The streets were empty, the streetlights flickering faintly as we parked by the forgotten shed. The air was cold, and a strange stillness hung around us. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ben led the way, pulling back the broken boards that partially covered the shed's side. There, just as he'd promised, was a rusty metal hatch. The hinges creaked as we pried it open, and the smell that drifted up from below hit us. A foul mix of damp earth and something metallic, almost like blood. With our flashlights in hand, we descended the old ladder into the darkness. The walls were rough and wet, water trickling down in narrow streams. The beam from my flashlight flickered as we stepped onto solid ground, and I felt the cold press in, like we'd left the world of the living behind us. The tunnel stretched out in both directions, a narrow corridor disappearing into shadow. The further we walked, the more unsettling the silence became. Our footsteps echoed, but they were swallowed quickly, as if the darkness was absorbing the sound. After a few minutes, Ben grinned at me. "So, any thoughts on how we're going to explain this to people if we find something freaky?" I laughed nervously, but my voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. "Probably just say we got lost on a dare," I replied, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. But the silence closed back in, thicker this time, and I felt a strange heaviness in the air. I told myself it was just the confined space messing with me. But then we heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from deeper in the tunnel. We froze. I glanced at Ben, whose face was illuminated in the faint glow of his flashlight. He looked as uneasy as I felt. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes wide. We both turned our lights toward the direction of the sound, but there was only darkness. Nothing moved. "Maybe it's a rat," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. But I could tell he didn't believe that, and neither did I. The sound had been too deliberate, like someone, or something, was pacing just out of sight, waiting. We pressed on, moving slowly now, our flashlights barely penetrating the thick blackness. The tunnel twisted and turned, and each corner seemed to pull us deeper. There were strange markings on the walls, scratches and symbols I didn't recognize. They looked old, as if they'd been carved by someone, or something, that had been here a long time ago. Ben stopped suddenly, shining his light on a section of wall covered in graffiti. But this wasn't normal graffiti. There were words scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting. I hear them in the dark. "Don't go further." My heart pounded as I read it, my mind racing with questions. Who had written this? And who were they? Ben chuckled, a sound that was more nervous than amused. "Creepy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Probably just some teenagers messing around. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear creeping up my own spine. We continued in silence, every nerve in my body on edge, every sound amplified by the claustrophobic space. Then we saw it, a faint light flickering further down the tunnel. It was different from our flashlights, softer and unsteady, like a candle's glow. Ben and I exchanged a look. "Do you think someone else is down here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Only one way to find out," he replied, trying to sound braver than he looked. We moved toward the light, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and I could feel something. A presence watching us just beyond the reach of our lights. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. As we approached, we saw the source of the light, a small alcove carved into the tunnel wall. Inside, an old oil lamp flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the stone. Next to it was a tattered journal, its pages yellowed and stained. Ben picked it up, flipping through the pages. His face paled as he read, his hands shaking. "Listen to this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They come in the dark, their eyes watching, waiting. I tried to leave, but the paths changed. I'm trapped." My blood ran cold as he continued reading. The journal was filled with entries, each one more frantic, more desperate. Whoever had written this had been lost down here, slowly losing their mind, haunted by something lurking in the shadows. "We should go," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But as we turned to leave, the shuffling sound returned, louder this time, echoing through the tunnels. It was closer now, coming from behind us. I felt a surge of panic, my mind racing as I realized we weren't alone. We started running, our footsteps echoing wildly as we sprinted through the dark. But the sounds followed, growing louder, faster, until it felt like they were right behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Their faces were obscured, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. We turned a corner, but the path was different now, twisting in ways it hadn't before. My heart pounded as we ran, the tunnel seeming to shift around us, leading us deeper, further from any hope of escape. "Ben!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "We're lost!" He didn't respond, his face pale and stricken with terror. We ran until our legs burned, the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down. And then, suddenly, we stumbled into a dead end. I turned, shining my flashlight back down the tunnel, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The figures were gone, but the silence was worse than the sounds. It was as if the tunnels themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, cold and hollow, "You shouldn't have come here." The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment I saw them. Faces twisted in agony, eyes empty and staring. They were all around us, their hands reaching out, clawing at the air. The flashlight went out, plunging us into total darkness. I heard Ben scream, his voice echoing, fading into the black. I reached for him, but there was nothing, just empty air and the cold, suffocating silence. And then, everything went still. I don't remember how I made it out. One moment, I was lost in the darkness, and the next, I was stumbling into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Ben was gone, and no one believed my story. The police searched the tunnels but found nothing. No journal, no lamp, no sign of Ben. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear them, the shuffling footsteps, the whispers echoing in the dark, calling me back to the place I swore I'd never return. They say the book only appears to those who need it most. Desperate people, the lost souls who would do anything to change their fate. But I hadn't thought of myself as desperate or lost, at least not until that rainy October night when I stumbled across it, wedged between two rotting boxes in the basement of an old bookstore. The cover was cracked leather, no title, just the faint outline of strange symbols that looked somehow familiar, yet unsettling. I should have left it there. I should have shut it, left the bookstore, and never looked back. But the pull was undeniable, like the book had chosen me. As I reached out to touch the dusty cover, a chill ran down my spine, like someone was standing right behind me, watching. I whipped around, heart pounding, but the basement was empty. Just shelves lined with forgotten relics, and the quiet hum of an old radiator. When I opened it, the words inside seemed to shift, swirling and twisting on the page as though they were alive. I couldn't read a single word, but as I stared, I felt them burn into my mind, leaving marks I couldn't erase. That night I brought the book home. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to know if it was as dangerous as it felt. Maybe it was the mystery or the thrill. I was never one to believe in curses or magic, but something about it felt wrong. I placed it on my nightstand and tried to ignore the odd whispers that filled my head, echoes of voices in a language I'd never heard before. They weren't loud, more like distant murmurs on the edge of hearing, fading in and out with the rhythm of my heartbeat. It was as if the book was calling to me, begging me to read it, and every time I resisted, the voices grew louder, more insistent. The next day I tried to return the book. I went back to the old bookstore, but when I stepped inside, the shop was empty. No shelves, no books, nothing but dust-covered walls and the faint smell of mold. I was so sure it had been there. I'd bought books from that place before. But now, there was no sign it had ever existed. I ran my fingers over the cover, wondering if I was going mad, if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But the weight of it was solid in my hands, heavy with a history that I could feel but not understand. Days passed, and the book stayed beside my bed. Every time I tried to sleep, I could feel it there, a dark presence looming, filling the room with a chilling energy that kept me tossing and turning. Each night the whispers grew stronger, taking on words that I could understand, promises of power, freedom, secrets beyond human knowledge. All I had to do was open it again, really open it, and let the words in. One night, I couldn't resist anymore. The whispers had worn me down, eroded my fears, replaced them with curiosity. I opened the book to the first page, and the letters stopped shifting. They settled into a language I didn't recognize, but somehow could read, each word burning like fire into my brain. The first page was a warning. To read is to awaken is to sacrifice. It sounded like nonsense, but I felt a shiver run through me. My hands were trembling, but I turned the page anyway, drawn in by an inexplicable need. The text described a ritual, something old and forbidden, promising that whatever I desired could be mine. I wasn't sure what I desired, maybe peace, maybe sleep, maybe just freedom from the torment that had crept into my life since finding the book. But that night, I performed the ritual, more out of exhaustion than belief. I drew the symbols with shaking hands, whispered the incantations written in that otherworldly script. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt a foolish relief, laughing at my own gullibility. But then the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows around me began to lengthen, twisting and curling like smoke. The air grew thick, pressing in on me, making it hard to breathe. And then I heard it. A faint scratching sound like claws scraping against the floor. I glanced around, but the room was empty, except for the book. It lay open on the bed, pages fluttering as if moved by an invisible wind. The scratching grew louder, turning into a guttural, inhuman growl. I felt a presence looming over me, something dark and ancient, watching me with hungry eyes. I slammed the book shut, heart pounding, and for a moment the room was silent. But then the voices returned, louder, angrier, filling my mind with screams that clawed at my sanity. I tried to throw the book out, to get rid of it, but every time I left it somewhere, it would reappear by my bedside, waiting. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the book, marched to the fireplace, and threw it into the flames, watching as the leather cover caught fire and the pages began to blacken and curl. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally broken the curse. But then I heard it, a soft whisper calling my name drifting from the flames. I backed away, heart racing, as the book seemed to resist the fire, the flames licking around it but leaving the pages untouched. The whisper grew louder, a seductive voice that promised escape, power, everything I'd ever wanted, if I would only read one more page. I couldn't resist. I reached into the fire, barely feeling the heat, and opened the book again. The pages were blank, except for a single sentence scrawled in dark, dripping ink. The final sacrifice is you. Suddenly, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, pulling me toward the book. I struggled, but the grip tightened, dragging me closer. I could feel myself being pulled into the pages, the words consuming me, filling my vision until all I could see was darkness. The last thing I heard was the book snapping shut, sealing me inside. And now I wait, trapped within its pages, my voice joining the chorus of whispers calling out to anyone who dares to open it next. If you ever find a book with no title, hidden in the shadows of some forgotten place, heed this warning. Leave it be. I didn't believe in ghosts. Never really gave them a thought, to be honest. That is, until last November when I encountered something, or rather, someone, that I still can't explain. It was supposed to be a simple drive home, the last leg of a cross-country road trip. I was somewhere deep in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of dark, winding back road that you'd find on the cover of a horror novel. There was no cell service, no cars for miles, and no signs of life. Just me, my headlights cutting through the night and a thin mist swirling over the asphalt. As I rounded a bend, I noticed someone standing by the side of the road. A woman, alone in the pitch-black night. She was dressed oddly, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white dress that clung to her in the cold. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the darkness, and she was staring directly at me. I slowed the car to a crawl, my instincts warring with my better judgment. Every logical part of my brain screamed, keep driving, but there was something about her, something that felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Against my better judgment, I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and shaky. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at me with those vacant, almost glassy eyes, her head tilting slightly as if considering something. Then, finally, she nodded and approached the passenger side. I leaned over to unlock the door, and for a moment, I hesitated. I couldn't see her face clearly. Her long, dark hair fell over her shoulders, hiding her features. There was a faint smell, something old and musty, like forgotten clothes in an attic. But before I could change my mind, she slid into the seat beside me, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone who hadn't been inside a car in a very long time. I pulled back onto the road, the silence between us thick and oppressive. I glanced over at her, hoping for some kind of small talk, an explanation, anything. But she was staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the road. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered. "Just down the road," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. There was something odd about her tone, a flatness, like it was drained of emotion. A little further. The road stretched on, each mile feeling like an eternity. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of leaves under the tires. She didn't seem to blink, didn't seem to move at all. Her presence felt heavy, like she was somehow more real, more solid than everything else around us. After a few minutes, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Are you from around here?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "I was." A chill ran down my spine. "I was." The words echoed in my head, unsettling in a way I couldn't shake. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired, that the long drive was getting to me. But there was something deeply unnerving about her, the way she sat so still, the way her eyes never seemed to focus on anything. I glanced over at her again, trying to get a better look, and that's when I noticed something strange. Her hands, folded so delicately in her lap, looked almost wrong. The skin was too pale, too smooth, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. And her fingernails, they were broken and jagged, as if she'd been clawing at something. My stomach twisted, a sick feeling washing over me. I forced my eyes back to the road, trying to shake the growing sense of dread creeping over me. I couldn't explain it, but something about her felt off, like she didn't quite belong. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The mist outside was thickening, wrapping around the car like a shroud. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but I could feel her presence beside me, a constant, oppressive weight. Then, just as I was starting to think this whole thing was some kind of fever dream, she spoke again. "Turn here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I looked around, confused. There was no turn, no road, just dense trees pressing in on both sides. "There's nothing there," I said, my voice sounding thin and shaky. "Turn here," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car and looked for some kind of path. And then, out of nowhere, a narrow dirt road appeared, barely visible in the fog. I didn't remember seeing it before, but it was there now, as clear as day. I turned down the path, my heart pounding. The car bounced and jostled over the uneven ground, the headlights barely piercing the thick fog. She was silent beside me, her face an unreadable mask. After a few minutes, the trees opened up, and we emerged into a clearing. In the middle of it was an old, decrepit house, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at us. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. "Stop here," she whispered. I parked the car, my hands shaking. I didn't know why I was doing this, why I was letting her lead me to this place that radiated danger. But something about her, about this whole situation, felt like a trap I couldn't escape. She opened the door and stepped out, moving with a strange, almost unnatural grace. She didn't look back at me, didn't say a word, just started walking toward the house. I sat there, paralyzed, every instinct telling me to drive away. But I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off her as she disappeared into the darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the house. Minutes, maybe hours. Time felt strange, warped. I thought about leaving, about pretending this never happened. But then I saw her again, standing in one of the upstairs windows, her pale face pressed against the glass, and she was smiling. The sight jolted me into action. I threw the car into reverse, my heart pounding as I backed away from the house. But as I turned onto the road, something caught my eye. A small, weathered sign half buried in the dirt. It was faded and cracked, but I could just make out the words. Evelyn Miller, missing since 1948. My blood ran cold. I looked back at the house, my heart hammering in my chest. The woman in the white dress was gone, vanished as if she had never been there. But her smile, that chilling, unnatural smile, was burned into my mind. I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road and back onto the main highway. The mist was thicker now, swirling around me like a living thing. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat, that eerie smile still on her face. But the car was empty. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. It wasn't until I got home, safe and sound, that I dared to look in the rearview mirror one last time. And there, faint but unmistakable, was a handprint on the glass. A small, delicate handprint, as if she had pressed her fingers against the window, leaving a part of herself behind. I don't drive that road anymore. I don't go anywhere near it. And whenever I pass by a hitchhiker on a lonely stretch of highway, I keep my eyes straight ahead. Because sometimes, when I glance into the shadows, I can almost see her standing there waiting for someone to take her home. The day I found the doll in the attic was the beginning of the end. It was an overcast afternoon, and the house was drenched in that eerie stillness only an old, abandoned property can hold. I had inherited the house from my aunt, a distant relative I barely remembered. She'd lived alone, reclusive and eccentric, in this crumbling estate that stood on the edge of a dense forest. Most of my family avoided the place. They said there was something off about it. But I couldn't resist exploring it. I'm not sure if it was curiosity or something else, something pulling me toward it. The attic was the last place I searched. It was dark and filled with a thick layer of dust, broken furniture, and boxes stacked to the rafters. That's when I noticed the faint outline of a small figure tucked in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of old paintings. The doll was unlike anything I'd seen before, clothed in an old-fashioned dress with delicate lace, her face frozen in an expression that was neither smile nor frown. But her eyes, they were hollow, dark, and gleaming. And though it sounds insane, I could have sworn they looked straight through me. I wasn't normally squeamish, but something about her made my skin crawl. I almost left her there, but a strange urge, a compulsion I couldn't explain, made me reach out, gently cradling the doll in my hands. Her weight surprised me. She felt heavier than she looked, almost as if she were holding something dark and cold within her. I took the doll back downstairs, placing her on the mantel in the living room. She watched from there as I unpacked my things, her dark eyes following me with a kind of silent vigilance. I was unsettled but brushed it off as my imagination running wild. After all, a doll was just a doll, or so I thought. That night I was awakened by a faint noise. It was subtle at first, a soft scraping sound, like something small and light being dragged across wood. I sat up, straining to listen, the house eerily silent around me. My heart pounded as I got out of bed, moving slowly toward the living room. The moonlight spilling through the window illuminated the room just enough to make out her shape on the mantel. Only she wasn't sitting there anymore. My heart thumped violently as I saw her lying face down on the floor near the foot of the fireplace. I tried to convince myself she must have simply fallen, maybe a gust of wind or an unsteady placement. But something in me knew better. Shaking, I picked her up, placing her back on the mantel, and went back to bed. But as soon as I lay down, the noise returned. Louder this time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I was frozen, gripping the sheets as the noise grew nearer, seeming to inch closer and closer to my room. I couldn't bring myself to move, and for a long, agonizing moment I lay there, hoping it was some animal or perhaps just my imagination. Then I felt it, a gentle, almost childlike tug at the corner of my blanket. In a panic, I grabbed my phone, switching on the flashlight. My heart nearly stopped when I saw her, sitting at the foot of my bed, her lifeless eyes staring straight at me. I threw her into the hallway and slammed the door shut, breathing heavily. I was shaken more than I wanted to admit and stayed awake until dawn, half expecting her to somehow appear in the room again. When morning finally came, I was convinced I was done with that doll. I took her outside, placing her in a wooden crate with plans to bury her deep in the woods. But just as I was about to dig, an inexplicable sense of dread filled me. The forest felt silent, watching, and I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I couldn't bring myself to bury her there. Instead, I returned to the house, deciding I'd drop her off at a donation center or simply throw her away in town. But, of course, it wasn't that easy. Later that night, after I'd managed to calm myself, I drifted off into a fitful sleep, only to be awakened by that same scratching noise. It was louder this time, the sound echoing through the empty halls, like nails dragging along wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be a dream, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I opened my eyes, and there she was, standing at the edge of my bed, her hollow eyes boring into mine, closer than ever. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed the doll, my hand trembling as I held her out at arm's length and tossed her into the fireplace. I lit a match, dropping it in, and watched as the flames consumed her. The fabric blackened, curling in the heat, her face melting and distorting as the fire took hold. I felt a surge of relief, almost victorious, watching her burn away to nothing. But that night, as I lay back in bed, the relief vanished. The scratching sound returned, but this time it was inside my room. The noise seemed to come from within the walls, crawling its way closer, relentless. I tried to block it out, covering my ears, but it was no use. The scratching grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to echo from within the room. Whispers that seemed to be calling my name. I rushed out of bed, stumbling into the hallway, heart racing, only to find her sitting there, completely intact, staring up at me with those hollow eyes. I don't know what terrified me more, that she was still here, or that I could almost swear her face had twisted into a smile. In the following days, my life became a nightmare. Every time I tried to rid myself of the doll, she'd find her way back to me. I left her in dumpsters, threw her into rivers, buried her in isolated fields miles from the house. But each time she returned, waiting for me in the most unexpected places. On my bed, the kitchen counter, even once in the passenger seat of my car as I drove back from an attempt to discard her in the next town over. The worst part was the changes in her appearance. At first, it was subtle. Her eyes seemed to narrow, her mouth twisted in a grin that grew wider each time I saw her. Her dress became dirtier, fraying at the edges, as though she'd been clawing her way back to me. Soon she was covered in strange stains, like dried blood, and her hair had become tangled and matted, as if she'd been crawling through dirt and grime. And then one night I woke up to find her on my chest, pinning me down with an unnatural weight. I couldn't move. Her hollow eyes were inches from my face, and I felt a cold, oppressive presence pressing down on my lungs. Her small porcelain hands seemed to tighten around my neck. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My vision darkened, and I was on the verge of passing out when the pressure suddenly lifted. I jolted upright, gasping for air, but she was gone. Only the faintest trace of a whisper lingered in the room, chilling my blood. The days blurred together, my mind unraveling. I was terrified to sleep, terrified to move, terrified to stay in the house, yet unable to leave. I researched endlessly, looking for explanations, but there was nothing. No curse, no folklore that explained the relentless evil bound to this doll. I reached out to every paranormal expert, every medium I could find, but each one refused to help the moment I mentioned the doll. One of them even hung up in the middle of our call, whispering, You can't escape her. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The whispers are louder now, calling my name, echoing in my head even when she's not there. I see her in every reflection, feel her presence watching me from the corners of my vision. Last night I woke to find my hands covered in dirt, scratches lining my arms. I don't remember leaving the house, but I found a fresh grave dug just beyond the forest's edge, and the doll sitting by the foot of my bed. As I write this, I can feel her watching, her dark eyes boring into me from across the room. And somehow, I know that this is only the beginning.